sheet that's just on the surface of a bone. It's called the periosteum. So when it comes to the calvaria up here, you've got a periosteal layer of the meninges, and then you've got a little split and a cavity, and then you have the dura mater, and that cavity that's made there is a dural venous sinus. Okay, so that's what we see here. The function of the dural venous sinuses is to collect up blood and cerebrospinal fluid from circulating around the brain and take it back to the jugular vein, put it back into circulation. So they function like veins. So this is the biggest one up here. That's called the superior sagittal sinus.
That's the blue line?
That's the blue line, okay? So keep in mind what's happening. You've got the brain in here, and it's highly vascularized, and as that blood is used up, it goes into the cerebral and cerebellar veins, and those feed into these sinuses. And then also, we'll talk about the meningeal layers. The cerebrospinal fluid circulates beneath the meninges. And so for it to get back into the veins, it has to go percolating through these tiny little spigots called arachnoid granulations. And they let it seep out of the subarachnoid space and into those sinuses. So surrounding the brain are these tiny little spigots that stick up into this sinus, and they let that CSF slowly but surely go back in there. So it collects the CSF back into the venous circulation. Otherwise, you would just collect CSF and it would compress the brain. So we have to have a way for it to circulate out. All right, so it's a collection system. They're sewers. So they collect that material, and now it runs either anteriorly or posteriorly. Most of it runs posteriorly. So for that, we're going to look over here for a second. Now, if you cut this open, we've got the superior sagittal sinus that runs this way, right? So in a transverse section, we're not going to see the whole thing, but you see the posterior and anterior parts of it. And if we follow that down, okay, we're dropping down farther and farther. We're still going. So this is a pretty big sinus here. It's just continuing posteriorly. And we go down far enough, and we keep going down until we get down to that nuchal line that we learned about with the bones. And boom, look at that. Okay. Then on the inside of the occipital bone, we find this really large sinus that runs transverse, and it's called the transverse sinus. Okay. So superior sagittal sinus runs back to the transverse sinus, which runs laterally to just behind the ear, and then it drops down in a little downspout, and that's going to become what's called the sigmoid sinus. So if we go a little bit lower, we'll see a spot where it zigzags like that. That's a sigmoid sinus. And then the end of the sigmoid sinus is actually the internal jugular vein. And now that's going to take this blood out of the head and neck. Okay. So your sinuses flow superior sagittal backwards to this area, which is called the confluence of the sinuses. And then through the confluence of the sinuses, through the transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, jugular. That's the main flow. Okay. Superior sagittal, confluence, transverse, sigmoid, jugular. So once you get that down, you can put a few other little nuances on it, okay?
Is the confluence another word for like the back of the sinuses?
It's where the superior sagittal meets the transverse.
Okay.
It's right there.
And what about the cavernous?
Okay, so remember, we'll add a few nuances, right? So those are the main ones, and everything kind of hangs on that. So if you get that, back in the day, you remember, you ever see the pictures of the people that wore the big dental headgear? Right? It's got like the metal thing that goes around the head and kind of holds everything in place, not outside. Right? So the frame that you want to think of is that superior sagittal to the confluence to the transverse to the sigmoid to the jugular. And then other things run into that. So up here, and this is where it gets a little confusing because we're looking at dural venous sinuses, right, which are actually like veins. Now you know what these little pockets are. These are the perinasal sinuses, which are actually cavities in the bones. Okay. That one that's back here, remember what that one's called? No, the maxillary would be over here. No, that's these.
Sphenoid?
There you go. These are, all right. So around the sphenoidal sinuses, but interior to the cranial cavity, are these large veins. The blue, not the red, but the blue. The blue are the cavernous sinus. They're kind of these bulbous venous pockets that sit around the body of the sphenoid bone here. So those are the cavernous sinus. And we can see them at a couple levels here. They're a little bit wider. So that's the cavernous sinus. Now there are some other small sinuses that run over the temporal bone and back here, and these are called petrosal sinuses and straight sinus, and I don't really hold you responsible for knowing those, but that's how these connect back to the confluence. So these aren't isolated in space, but they actually connect back to the confluence as well. Okay. And you can just barely make the straight sinus out here in a couple of sections. It's actually right here. And that runs right there.
Is that the mini brain goes through?
That is part of the cerebellum.
Oh.
It goes over the cerebellum, between the cerebellum and the ventral surface of the cerebrum. Okay.
But you're not too worried about us knowing.
I think the only ones that I put on the list for you to know were the cavernous, transverse, confluence, superior sagittal, sigmoid.
You do have the straight on there.
And I
as
do
well.
have the straight. Okay, all right. Well then.
Just in case you
So,
ask us.
so that's the beginning of it, and it moves, it arcs. So we're not going to get one section, we're going to see the whole thing.
But that's over the cerebellum, that one runs.
Yeah, right. So you can see different parts of it there. Boom, 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 as it arcs back. And as it disappears at that point, then it would connect here. Okay?
Yep.